It was 6:30 in the morning when Eli Ramirez saw the bride with a spray can. The fog had barely lifted off the streets of Salmer Cove. The coastal wind was quiet that day. Even the sea seemed to hold its breath. Eli had just locked his toolbox into the back of his pickup when he glanced down the narrow alley beside St. Agnes, the old boarded-up chapel, with ivy chewing through its stone bones. There, beneath a peeling stained glass window and a row of broken shingles, stood a woman in a white wedding dress. She was barefoot. The hem of her gown was soaked with dirt and paint, dragging behind her like a forgotten promise. In one hand, she held a can of navy blue spray paint. In the other, a bouquet of dried thistle and baby's breath, tied with fraying ribbon. And on the chapel's crumbling wall, she was painting a lighthouse. Not the usual kind. This one leaned to the side slightly, as if tired. The light at its top was flickering, jagged, almost broken. Around it, waves crashed not with violence, but with the slow pressure of time. Eli didn't move. From where he stood, half-shadowed by the morning fog, he could hear the faint rattle of the spray can with each pass. Her strokes were careful, intentional, almost reverent. She didn't look around, didn't seem to care who saw her. Or maybe she'd assumed no one would be watching this early. Eli pulled the knit cap lower on his head and walked into the bakery next door. He left with 2 cups of black coffee and a brown paper bag. He stood for a moment on the sidewalk looking at her again. She was still painting, now working on the rocks beneath the lighthouse, layering them with flecks of white and silver. He approached quietly, not like someone sneaking, just someone choosing to arrive gently. Without a word, he placed 1 cup on the ground just to her right. Then he set the bag beside it, still warm, a blueberry muffin. She didn't stop painting, but he saw her eyes flick toward the offering. No smile, no surprise, just a pause in her breath. Then Eli turned and walked away. He didn't expect her to follow, didn't even expect her to speak. He just went back to his truck and drove off toward the carpenter's yard. But something about the image stayed with him. The long white dress against the decay of the chapel, the calm precision in her hand, the way she looked like she belonged to nowhere in particular. By the time he reached the yard, the sun had started to rise higher, burning off the last of the fog. He climbed out, unlocked the shed, and set the day's work in motion. But all morning his thoughts kept returning to the lighthouse on that wall, and the woman painting it, dressed like someone who'd walked out on a wedding and into a dream she wasn't ready to wake from. That night, while locking up the shop, Eli passed the chapel again. The wall was quiet now, the paint still fresh, glistening under the street lamp. The lighthouse stood tall, tilted, imperfect, strangely dignified. The bride was gone. Only the empty coffee cup remained, and a bite missing from the muffin. Eli hated wind chimes, always had. But that night, standing on the porch of the house he'd built with his own hands 30 years ago, the old brass chimes that used to drive him mad now whispered like someone gently reminding him they were still there. Lucia had left them up. She said they reminded her of her mother. He didn't argue. Inside, the lights were off except for the one above the kitchen sink, the one Marisol always said made the house look kind, even from the outside. He dropped his keys into the ceramic bowl on the counter and slipped off his boots. Lucia was at the dining table, headphones around her neck, sketching something into her notebook. She looked up when he entered. "You're late." "I stopped by the yard," he said, hanging his jacket. She didn't respond right away. Then she closed her notebook and folded her arms on the table. "You've been quiet lately." "I've always been quiet," Eli said. She gave him that look, half teenage sass, half inherited intuition. "No, I mean ghost quiet, like you're here but not really here." He opened the fridge, pulled out a glass bottle of soda, then thought better of it and grabbed water instead. Lucia kept going. "I know you don't want to talk about Mom all the time, I get it. But it's been 6 years, Dad. Maybe it's okay if something else starts living in this house again." Eli didn't answer. He took a sip of water and leaned on the counter. "You ever seen someone painting a lighthouse in a wedding dress?" he asked. Lucia blinked. "That's not where I thought this conversation was going." He shrugged. "Just curious." There was a long pause, the kind that lived comfortably between them. Then she stood stretched and kissed his cheek. "I've got an early train tomorrow. Try not to stay up sanding kitchen cabinets till 2 a.m. "Not sanding tonight," he said softly. She gave him a smile before disappearing down the hallway, the light in her room flicking on, then off again a few seconds later. Eli stood alone in the kitchen. The wind chimes outside tapped like fingers on a memory. He opened the narrow utility closet beside the fridge, reached behind the spare light bulbs and an old radio, and pulled out the tin box. It was scratched and dented and smelled faintly of linseed oil. Inside, wrapped in a square of canvas, was the old paintbrush. Handle smooth from use, bristles a little frayed, stained with cream, coral, and lavender colors Marisol once chose for the nursery that was never finished. Eli sat down at the table, turned the brush over in his hands, then set it gently in front of him. It had been years, not since she passed, not even since the funeral. The last time he'd touched this brush was the night she'd told him in that quiet voice full of certainty, "If I go first, don't stop making things, even if no one asks you to." He hadn't listened. Until today. Until that lighthouse on the chapel wall, tilting under invisible weight, steady in its brokenness. Outside, the wind stirred again. The brass chimes sang a softer note. Eli sat at the table for a long time, the paintbrush in front of him like a question he hadn't figured out how to answer yet. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't rush to put it away. By the time Eli returned to St. Agnes the next morning, the fog had pulled back like a tide. The alley beside the chapel was sharp with light now. No longer secretive, just still. The wall was there. The lighthouse was still there. And so was she. June was crouched low beside the wall, her wedding dress swapped out for jeans and a gray sweatshirt, sleeves pushed up to her elbows. Her hair was tied back, messy and hurried. In one hand, she held a rag soaked in something harsh-smelling. In the other, a metal scraper. She was erasing it. The lighthouse, the waves, the streaks of silver across the rocks. She was taking it all down. Eli didn't speak. He just stood at the edge of the alley for a moment, watching as she scrubbed a half-finished gull's wing into oblivion. Her movements weren't angry. They weren't regretful either. Just tired, just necessary. There was a red plastic bucket beside her, half filled with sudsy water. He walked forward slowly. Her eyes caught him, then returned to the wall. She didn't flinch. He said nothing. He picked up a second rag from the ground, dipped it into the bucket, and began working from the other side. They wiped in silence. The wall hissed softly beneath their hands. Paint peeled under pressure. The mural faded line by line. A few curious passers-by slowed at the corner, looked once, then moved on. Salmer Cove was like that. It didn't stare too long, and it rarely asked questions when answers weren't being offered. At one point, June stood, wiped her forehead with the sleeve of her sweatshirt, and said without looking at him, "You didn't have to." Eli wrung out his rag. "Didn't say I did." She gave a short exhale, neither laugh nor sigh, and crouched again. An hour passed, maybe more. By the time they stepped back from the wall, the lighthouse was gone. Just a ghost of color remained, smudged and incomplete, like a memory someone had tried too hard to forget. Eli dropped the rag into the bucket, wiped his hands on his jeans, and looked up at the chapel's boarded windows. "They never did fix this place," he said. June nodded. "I don't think they know who it belongs to anymore." He nodded too, like that meant something. Then he turned, walked to the curb, and leaned against his truck. She followed, slower. There were paint stains on her hands, under her nails, up the side of her neck like fingerprints from a restless dream. They stood there in the silence that comes after effort, the kind that doesn't ask for a thank you. After a moment, June pulled something from her pocket, a single glove, black, fingerless. She twisted it in her hand, then stilled. "I didn't mean to make a mess," she said. Eli squinted toward the ocean, barely visible past the end of the street. "You weren't the first," he said. "This wall's worn worse." She glanced over at him. "That's supposed to make me feel better?" "Nope," he said. "Just true." She gave a small nod, then looked at the chapel one last time. "I'll be out of the house by the end of the week," she added. "Didn't expect to stay this long." He didn't ask which house. He already knew. Instead, he reached into the cab of his truck, pulled out a plastic bottle of water and handed it to her. She took it, drank in silence, then passed it back. "Thanks," she said. He tipped his head. "Paint comes off, sometimes." Then he climbed into his truck. She stayed on the sidewalk a moment longer, staring at the wall that was no longer hers. And when he pulled away, Eli didn't look in the rearview mirror, but if he had, he would have seen her bending down to pick up the rag he left behind. The house on Cedar Bluff didn't look like much from the outside. Shingles curled at the edges like old receipts. Paint peeled in strips, revealing weathered wood beneath, pale and dry as drift. The porch sagged slightly to the left like it had given up holding its own weight years ago. Eli stood at the base of the steps, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes scanning each line of the frame the way a doctor might study a tired heart. June opened the door before he knocked. No makeup, no expression, just a nod. She stepped aside. He entered. The inside was cleaner than he expected, sparse, mostly empty, but not hollow. The smell of salt air mixed with something citrus, lemon maybe, and underneath that, faint but distinct, the smell of turpentine. A painter's house, even without a canvas in sight. "I'd like to fix the bedroom first," she said, leading him through the narrow hallway. "The floorboards creak, window sticks when it rains." He followed, nodding slowly. "Second," she added, "the porch swing. It's not safe." "It's not attached," Eli said, already noting the missing bolts in his head. "It's just sitting there." She didn't answer. He bent, checked the trim along the doorframe, pressed gently at a loose plank. "You want it restored or replaced?" June hesitated, then, "Restored." That was the first thing she said with certainty. Eli nodded once, and they walked back toward the main room. "I've got a brush," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Had it for years. Belonged to my wife. She used it to paint the nursery." June turned. "You still use it?" "Sometimes," he said, "when the job matters." That made her pause. Not visibly, but something behind her posture eased. She folded her arms, leaned against the doorframe. "Why'd you take down my painting?" she asked. Not accusing, just curious. Eli didn't look up from his notebook. "Didn't. Helped." She almost smiled, not quite, but her voice softened. "I thought it would feel good to make something public. Loud, messy. And it didn't." Eli closed his notebook, tucked it into his back pocket. "Sometimes we make things to be seen, sometimes we make them so we don't have to say it out loud." She tilted her head. "What was your wife's name?" He looked over. "Marisol." A quiet moment passed. June looked around the room, her voice lower now. This place belonged to a woman named Edie, local painter. Taught high school art until she died. No family, just canvases stacked to the ceiling. I bought it last year, sight unseen. "Why here?" Eli asked. June looked out the window. "Because no one knows me here. And because the ocean sounds different when you're not pretending you're okay." He didn't reply. Didn't need to. Instead, he stepped toward the hallway, turned back just before the front door. I'll bring the tools tomorrow, porch first, then the window. She nodded. Before he left, he glanced once more at the swing. It was leaning against the wall now, like a folded memory. June followed his gaze. I don't know if I'll keep it. You don't have to decide yet, he said. You just have to let it hang again. When he stepped outside, the wind had picked up, but this time it didn't feel cold. Lucia hadn't meant to linger. She'd only come by to drop off her sketchbook. A favor, sort of. Her dad had asked her to leave it for June, said the woman might have some insight on charcoal shading. Eli wasn't home yet. The door to the house on Cedar Bluff stood half open. She knocked anyway. Silence. She stepped in, calling out softly. June? No answer. The place smelled like citrus and mineral spirits again. The kind of smell you don't forget, like burnt toast or old wood. Lucia's sneakers creaked against the bare floor. She walked past the kitchen into what used to be the den. And there on the far wall was herself. A portrait. Not a perfect one. It wasn't the kind of thing you frame or sell or display, but there was no mistaking it. The angle of the shoulders, the loose hair, the defiant tilt of the chin. She didn't even know June had noticed her that closely. It wasn't finished. The edges were raw, some lines still ghosted in graphite. But it was her. Lucia stood still for a long time, the kind of still that felt like waiting. The room was dim, lit only by a window with cracked panes and gauzy curtains that swayed like tired dancers. Dust clung to the baseboards. In the corner, a pile of frames leaned against each other like old friends who'd stopped holding grudges. The only sound was the ticking of a small clock on a shelf. It was 3 minutes slow. Lucia stepped closer to the wall, tracing the outline of her own face without touching it. It wasn't flattering. It wasn't sweet. It was real. And for a girl who had spent the past 6 years watching people tiptoe around grief like it was glass, seeing herself painted without sympathy felt like someone finally telling her the truth. She didn't hear June enter until the floor behind her gave a quiet groan. Lucia turned. June held a grocery bag in one hand, a gallon of milk in the other. She didn't look surprised to see the girl. Lucia cleared her throat. Sorry, door was open. June nodded. I forget sometimes. They stood in the room, awkward but not uncomfortable. Lucia gestured toward the wall. You drew me. June set the bag down. You were sitting on the back steps last week. Hoodie, red sneakers, hair tied like that. You didn't ask. I don't paint what people ask for, June said simply. Lucia folded her arms. So what was I then? A study in teenage angst? June walked to the table, pulled out a chair, and sat. No, a study in staying still even when the world doesn't. Lucia blinked. That wasn't the kind of answer she expected. She sat too, opposite the woman, close but not confronting. June pulled an orange from the bag, peeled it slowly, hands stained faintly with indigo and ochre. Your dad said you used to draw a lot. Lucia shrugged. I still do, just not things I care about. Why not? She looked away. Because the second I draw something real, he looks at me like he's afraid I'll disappear too. June didn't react, just peeled another strip, set it aside. Lucia leaned forward. Do you always run away from things? June met her gaze, unblinking. Do you always ask questions that feel like accusations? There was a pause. Then both of them smiled, small, crooked, involuntary. Lucia stood. You should probably finish the portrait. June raised an eyebrow. And if I do? Lucia glanced back at the wall. Then maybe I'll draw you next time. She left before June could reply, the screen door clicking gently behind her. Inside, June looked at the half-finished portrait. The light from the broken window fell across it in strips. She picked up a piece of charcoal, stared for a long time, then began to shade in the eyes. Carefully, deliberately, like she wasn't just finishing a drawing, like she was anchoring something back into the world. The bell above Ruth's cafe door gave its usual tired jingle when Eli walked in. He didn't need a menu, didn't need to speak either. Ruth saw him through the order window and pointed at the back booth, his usual. He slid in, stretched his fingers on the worn wooden table and stared at the salt shaker. Outside, seagulls circled low. Inside, the smell of coffee and burnt cinnamon rolls lingered like a conversation no one finished. Ruth came over with 2 mugs black coffee for him, chamomile for herself. She sat without asking. That was their rhythm. "You've been working up at Edie's place?" she asked. Eli nodded once. Ruth sipped her tea. "She's an odd one." He didn't answer. "I saw her last week," Ruth went on. "Had paint under her nails and no shoes on. Looked like she'd walked straight out of a dream and forgot to wake up." Eli gave a quiet exhale. "That's most of us these days." Ruth raised an eyebrow. "You know who she is?" Eli met her eyes. "Don't think she's figured that out yet." Ruth leaned back. The booth creaked. She stirred her tea even though it didn't need it. "They say she used to be somebody. New York gallery scene. Had a name. Then disappeared." Eli didn't blink. "She left something behind," Ruth added. "Or someone." There was no malice in her tone, just curiosity. The kind that lingers in small towns, where silence feels like permission to imagine the worst. Eli folded a paper napkin in half. Then again, perfect corners. "She's renting the place," he said, "fixing it up, paying cash, doesn't owe anyone here anything." Ruth sipped. "I know, but people get nervous when they can't label something or someone." "She's not a label," Eli said quietly. Ruth tilted her head. "No, but she's something. You see that, right?" He didn't answer. Instead, he looked out the window. June was walking by. Her sweatshirt hood was pulled over her head, but he recognized the slouch in her shoulders. She didn't look in. Didn't need to. Her pace never changed. Ruth followed his gaze, then turned back. "You trust her?" Eli thought about that. Not the way most people think, not like a test, more like a quiet leaning. "I trust how she holds a brush," he said. Ruth nodded slowly. That meant something coming from him. "She might leave, you know," she said. "Some people come here because they're lost, but some just pass through on their way to getting lost somewhere else." Eli looked down at the creased napkin in his hands. "Then maybe I'm just the guy holding the door open while they figure it out." Ruth smiled, not wide but warm. "Still fixing other people's broken porches, huh?" "Sometimes they fix mine too," Eli said, standing. He dropped a few bills on the table, left the coffee half full, and stepped outside. The air had shifted. Cooler now, a front rolling in. The kind that makes gulls fly lower and people walk faster without knowing why. He didn't see June again that day, but he looked at every corner like he might, and when he passed the alley beside St. Agnes, the wall was still blank. But he could swear it felt less empty. It started with a ladder, an old aluminum one that Eli had forgotten behind the chapel 2 weeks ago. June dragged it across the alley one morning, propped it against the same crumbling wall she had painted and erased. This time she wasn't hiding. She wore a denim jacket covered in paint smudges, boots streaked with mud, and a braid down her back, uneven and loose. In her hand was a stub of sidewalk chalk. She drew a simple outline at the center of the wall. A square with uneven edges and a narrow frame. A window, but not one that opened. Just one to look into. By noon, she had written a note on the wall beside it in small block letters. What would you paint if no one could tell you it was wrong? People stopped. They didn't always linger, but they looked. Kids touched the chalk. Some drew tiny hearts in the corner. Someone added a cat. Someone else drew a pizza. By the second day, June came back with extra chalk. She set them in a wooden box on the ground. No directions, no rules, just color. Lucia was the first to say something out loud. Passing by with her backpack slung over one shoulder, she raised an eyebrow. Guerrilla mural project? June didn't look away from the wall. Something like that. You starting a movement? June smiled faintly. Just letting people leave something that won't last. Lucia tilted her head. Isn't that what most things are? June paused, then nodded. Exactly. Later that afternoon, Eli walked by on his way back from the hardware store. He paused, watched June adjust a plank to make a makeshift shelf for supplies. She didn't ask him to help. He didn't offer. But the next morning, a bench appeared. Sturdy, simple, clean lines, unmarked, placed just far enough for someone to sit and watch without feeling part of it. No note, no name. June saw it and didn't mention it, but she sat on it that afternoon drinking coffee, watching two second graders argue over the color of clouds. By the end of the week, the wall was covered. There was a rocket ship with flowers for fire, a jellyfish with a human face, a broken heart taped together with a Band-Aid. In the center of it all, still untouched, was June's window. Ruth passed by one morning with a basket of bread and shook her head. I always said this town needed a new community center. Guess this is it now. June nodded politely. Eli came by to fix the side door of the chapel that had been swinging loose since last winter. He worked quietly, no hammering, just tightening and sanding. At one point, he stood beside June while she was repainting the border around a child's sun drawing. Why here? He asked, softly. She glanced over. Because it's forgotten, and sometimes those are the safest places to make something new. Eli nodded, then handed her a new brush, thicker, softer bristles. Yours look tired, he said. She took it. Aren't we all? When the sun set, the chalk drawings caught the last gold light. Some were already fading. A few had washed slightly from morning drizzle. June didn't fix them. Eli stayed on the bench until it was dark. And when he left, June remained, adding a small corner of blue to the bottom of the window. Just one square, one note of sky. Lucia wasn't looking for anything. She'd come home for the weekend just long enough to drop off laundry, steal a few real meals, and ask her dad if he was sleeping more than 5 hours a night. He grunted when she asked, which meant no. While waiting for the washer to finish, she wandered into the old guest room. It still smelled like cedar and dust. Same lace curtain, same bookshelf with sun-faded spines. The closet door creaked when she pulled it open. A stack of shoe boxes toppled halfway, knocking loose an envelope tucked between them. She didn't recognize the handwriting, but she knew the paper. Her mother's favorite, cream stock with deckled edges. The kind she always said made even sadness look dignified. Lucia sat cross-legged on the floor and opened the flap. The letter inside wasn't dated. No salutation, just a few lines, written in ink that had started to fade. If I go first, don't stop making things, even if they're not beautiful. Even if they're crooked or slow or unfinished, don't wait for permission to come alive again. You don't have to repaint the house. Just repaint yourself. Lucia stared at the paper. No signature, but there didn't need to be one. She read it twice, then folded it gently, slipped it into her hoodie pocket, and walked downstairs. Eli was in the garage sanding the frame of an old stool. His sleeves were rolled to the elbows, dust clung to the creases of his arms. The radio played something low and wordless. She stood at the doorway, watching him for a long beat. Dad? He looked up. She held the letter out. "I found this upstairs." He didn't speak, just wiped his hands and took the paper. She didn't leave, but she didn't stay too close either. Just enough distance to let him choose what to do with it. Eli read the note slowly. His eyes didn't change, his breathing did. When he finished, he folded it once, then again. His thumb lingered on the crease. "She wrote this the week after she stopped treatment," he said. "I never knew she kept it." Lucia didn't move. "Maybe she meant for you to find it when you were ready." He looked at her then, not past her, not through her. Just looked. The way people do when something small shifts inside. Too quiet to name but loud enough to echo. "I thought I was doing okay," he said softly. "I didn't realize I'd just stopped." Lucia stepped closer. "You didn't stop, Dad, you just paused." He smiled barely. "Longest pause I ever took." She nodded. "Well, maybe it's time to unpause." They stood in the garage, surrounded by unfinished wood and half-used cans of stain. Eli looked at his hands, dry, nicked, lined with years. Then at the wall across from him. Bare. He walked over, picked up a brush from the old tin he hadn't touched in months. It wasn't Marisol's. That one stayed wrapped in cloth. This was his. He dipped it in white primer and made a slow, wide stroke across the wall. Nothing fancy, nothing permanent, just the beginning of a new layer. Lucia smiled. "That's not bad." He glanced back at her. "It's not finished. Neither are you." The brush hovered for a second, then continued. Outside, the wind rattled the chimes. Inside, something steady had started to move again. It appeared one morning. No announcement, no preparation. Just there. Eli arrived at the alley with a new set of sandpaper blocks. A boy had scrawled cartoon eyes over the window frame June had drawn. She'd asked if he could help fix it quietly with a soft smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The air smelled like chalk dust and dew. He turned the corner and stopped. The wall was different. Among the jellyfish, stars, initials in shaky handwriting, and faded suns, a new figure had emerged. Life-sized, subtle, like it had always been part of the wall, just waiting to be brushed into focus. It was him. Not a caricature, not a saint. Just Eli, standing by his bench, one foot slightly forward, shoulders squared but soft, head turned slightly toward the chapel like he was listening for something long gone. No lines of glory, no soft glow. But the way she'd painted the hands strong, worn, half-clenched around nothing made it clear. This was someone holding more than tools. It was someone holding on. Eli felt the breath catch in his throat before he realized he'd stopped breathing. He stepped closer. The collar of the jacket was slightly frayed. The boots had a dent where his real ones did. But it was the eyes that held him still. She'd painted him looking at something not in the frame, something just out of reach. He didn't remember her studying him like that, didn't remember offering that kind of permission. But there he was, made of pigment and silence. June was sitting a few feet away on the bench. She had a tin of brushes beside her, but she wasn't painting, just holding a cup of coffee. She didn't look up when he approached. "You don't like it," she said softly. Eli didn't answer. He stood in front of his painted self and felt something tighten behind his ribs. "I didn't ask," she said after a pause. "I should have, but I wasn't painting for anyone else." Still, he said nothing. He looked at the hand in the mural brushed in careful layers. It wasn't holding anything. Not a hammer, not a cup, not even the brush. Just empty, open. That's what undid him. Not the likeness, not the accuracy, the emptiness. Eli turned slightly, the bench creaking beneath his weight as he sat beside her. She passed him the second cup of coffee without a word. They sat like that for a while, side by side. No wall between them, but the one they both kept rebuilding without knowing. Eventually, Eli spoke. My wife used to say people only remember what you leave open. June sipped her coffee. She sounds like someone I would have liked. She was quieter than you, he said. June smiled faintly. Then I definitely would have liked her. The wind tugged at her braid. Eli set the coffee down. His voice was rougher now. I didn't expect to see myself there. And not like that. She didn't apologize. Then how? She asked. He looked down at his hands, probably bent over a broken fence, or staring at a nail too long, something small, something forgettable. June shook her head. No one forgets the person who sits still when everything else breaks. The mural didn't say much, but it didn't have to, because somewhere in those painted lines between the shadows and the light, June had seen something Eli had spent years trying to bury. And maybe, just maybe, she was telling him, I see it still. It was almost evening when the man showed up. The mural wall glowed faintly in the slanting sunlight. June had been fixing a crack near the lower corner where rainwater had smudged someone's drawing, a bird with uneven wings. She was humming something low, tuneless. Then she saw him, standing across the street, hands in the pockets of a long gray coat, no expression, just waiting. He didn't cross, didn't call her name, but she saw him, and she froze like the weight of air had suddenly shifted. Her brush hovered, then dropped. Eli was across the alley, sanding a doorframe. He didn't notice at first until he heard the sound of the tin bucket falling, water spilling across the pavement. He turned. June was gone. The brush on the ground, the chalk scattered. He followed the trail around the chapel and found her around the corner, leaning against the wall. Breathing hard, her hands were shaking. You all right? He asked, keeping his voice low. She didn't answer, just stared ahead like she wasn't sure which world she was standing in. He waited, gave her time, gave her space. Then she whispered, How did he find me? Eli didn't ask who, didn't need to. June wiped her hands on her jeans, smearing blue across her thighs. He didn't even say anything, just stood there like I owed him something. Her voice cracked on the last word. Eli looked over his shoulder. The man was gone. June kept talking, though her eyes were distant. I left New York without saying a word, not to my agent, not to my sister. I cut everything. I wanted it gone. Eli didn't press. She kept going. After the miscarriage, I couldn't breathe in that apartment. I painted the walls black and still felt like the light was mocking me. It was the first time she'd said the word aloud, miscarriage. It sat heavy between them. Eli stepped closer, not touching, but near enough. He doesn't get to come here and act like I owe him a reunion. June's breath shook again. I didn't leave for drama. I left to survive. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It pulsed. Then quietly she said, I'm leaving tonight. Eli didn't flinch. Where? He asked. I don't know, just not here. Not where he can look at me like that. Like I'm a ghost that owes him closure. Eli took a slow breath. You built something here. She looked up. I didn't mean to. That's how real things start. June let out a bitter laugh, barely more than a breath. I'm not built for staying, Eli. I make things, I leave, that's who I am. He met her eyes. Maybe that's who you were. The streetlight buzzed to life above them. June turned toward the house on Cedar Bluff. I'll pack what fits. The rest I'll leave behind. I've done it before. Eli watched her walk away. He didn't call after her, didn't ask her to stay, but that night when she drove off just after midnight, headlights low, trunk half full, the bench in front of the wall remained, clean, unmoved, and beside it, resting against the mural, was the brush he'd given her. wrapped in a strip of canvas left like a whisper or a thank you or a sorry. 3 days passed. June was gone. Her window on the wall stayed untouched. The drawings around it had begun to fade. Chalk never lasted long in a coastal town, but no one dared touch that center square. It stood there like a breath being held. Eli returned to the alley on the 4th day. He didn't bring tools, no paint buckets, no ladder, no sandpaper, just a small canvas barely the size of a clipboard and a box he hadn't opened in 6 years. It was still early. The air was damp and the town hadn't woken yet. He set the canvas down on the bench, adjusted his cap and pulled out a brush. Not Marisol's. That one stayed wrapped as always. This was one of his own. A short-handled thing, worn smooth near the ferrule. He dipped it into a small tin of blue, a shade he mixed himself. Something between dusk and memory. Then he began. No sketch, no plan, just strokes, simple, slow, sure. He didn't try to make it pretty, didn't think about symmetry or style. He just painted what had been sitting in the back of his ribs since June drove away. A road, cracked and curving, no buildings, no signposts. On either side fields of low, dry grass, the kind that whispers more than it waves, and in the middle, walking away from the viewer, was a figure, small, shoulders a little hunched, one hand at their side, not waving, not reaching, just walking, toward something or maybe from it. Eli didn't think about who it was meant to be. He just kept going. He layered the sky in grays and light amber, hints of pink like a memory of warmth. He left space in the top right corner. Didn't fill it, didn't explain it, just left it blank. When he finished, he didn't look for approval. There was no one to give it. But he didn't need that. He let the brush sit in his hand a moment longer, then set it down beside the canvas. It wasn't a masterpiece, it wasn't bold, but it was honest. For the first time in years, he'd made something without a deadline, a paycheck, or a request. Just for the sake of saying, I'm still here, I'm still moving, I'm not done yet. Later that afternoon, Ruth stopped by the alley. She didn't say much, just sat on the bench, stared at the canvas, and quietly left a thermos of tea beside it. Lucia came by at sunset. She didn't speak either. She just moved the canvas a few inches to the left where the light hit better, then walked away. No questions. That night, when Eli returned to lock up the tool shed, he looked one last time at the painting. The road on the canvas didn't end. It just kept going, off the frame, beyond the edge, into something unnamed, and for once that didn't scare him. Lucia had never meant to paint it. She was supposed to be doing homework. But the house was too still. The kind of still that sounds like someone left the door open in your chi. She set up in the garage, same table her father used to fix cabinet doors. Same radio with the broken dial. The canvas was one she'd half finished months ago. Just a horizon line and an empty porch swing. But that night, she added to it. One figure sitting on the swing facing away. Another leaning on the porch rail tall, hands tucked into the front pocket of a jacket. A third just at the edge of the steps, backpack slung low, hair caught in motion like she was arriving or leaving. She didn't give them faces, didn't need to. She left it on the bench in the alley the next morning, wrapped in brown paper tied with twine. She didn't sign it. Just taped a note to the back that read, "Some things don't need names to be true." That same day, a train pulled into the edge of Salmer Cove. Not many people got on, fewer got off. June sat by the window. She hadn't unpacked since leaving. She told herself she was just breathing elsewhere for a while. She hadn't meant to come back, not even for a minute. But something in her chest had curled too tight these last few days. A sound, a silence. She couldn't name it, so she stepped off the train, just for a moment, just to feel if the wind still smelled the same here. The platform was nearly empty. A teenager with headphones, a couple with too many bags, a woman handing out pamphlets to no one in particular. And beside the ticket kiosk, resting on the metal bench, was a small object wrapped in canvas. At first she thought it was forgotten trash, but when she stepped closer, her breath caught. It was the brush, the one Eli had given her. Short-handled, worn smooth, still faintly tinted with indigo at the tip. She stared at it. Someone had tied a thin string around the handle. Attached was a note on rough craft paper. No message, just a sketch. A window. With one square painted in blue, June stood still, not smiling, not crying, just still. Around her the world moved. Train engines rumbled low. Birds darted above the awning. A man with a broom swept the far end of the platform. But she didn't move, because for the first time in days, something inside her did. She sat down slowly, brush in hand. Let her shoulders drop. Let the weight return. Not heavy, not cruel, just there. And when the next train arrived an hour later, she didn't get on. Not yet. It was raining when she came back. Not the kind of rain that demands attention. Just a soft, sideways drizzle that made everything look like it had been drawn in pencil and then smudged by a tired hand. June stepped into the alley just after sunrise, wearing the same denim jacket, now darkened by water. Her boots squished softly, and in her left hand was a brush. No bag, no suitcase, no hello. She just walked up to the mural, stared at it for a long time, then reached into the small wooden box, the one someone had kept stocked with chalk and brushes even while she was gone. No one saw her arrive, but by the time Ruth opened her cafe, someone had already whispered, "She's back." Eli was fixing a gutter across town when Lucia called him. She didn't say much, just, "She's painting again." He didn't ask who. He didn't need to. He finished tightening the last bolt, washed his hands slowly, and drove down to the alley without turning on the radio. When he arrived, June was still painting. Not over anything, not erasing, just adding a small panel near the bottom corner, right beneath the portrait of Eli. It was quiet, abstract. Swirls of dark green, pale yellow, and a patch of burnt sienna that almost looked like a fingerprint. He didn't interrupt. He just stood by the edge, hands in his pockets, watching like you would watch someone rebuild something they weren't sure would hold. She noticed him, didn't say anything, just kept painting. The wall, after weeks of additions and weather, had changed. Some pieces were faded, others layered, like a living memory, messy, evolving, and stubbornly still here. June dipped her brush again, finished the curve of a line. Then finally she spoke. "I didn't plan to come back." Eli nodded. "I didn't plan to wait." She glanced sideways, a corner of her mouth lifted. "But you kept the brushes clean. You left them dirty," he said. "Felt wrong to wash them without asking." She smiled, tired but honest. "Is this still your bench?" she asked. "It's everyone's now," Eli said, easing himself down onto it. "But I warm it better than most." June sat beside him. The rain had slowed to a mist, like even the weather was trying to listen quietly. "I don't know what I'm doing next," she admitted. Eli looked at the mural. "You're doing it." She leaned back, staring at her own new patch of color. "I used to think art had to say something big to matter." Eli followed her gaze. "It only has to tell the truth." They sat like that for a while, not rebuilding, not reconciling, just resuming. Around them, the town moved on, slow, unbothered. But in that alley, the mural had changed again, not because someone had erased anything, but because someone came back and kept going. And for Eli, that was enough. The light hit the wall differently that morning. It was late autumn now, the kind of cold that made people walk faster but not quite bundle up. The alley still smelled faintly of chalk and salt air, but there was something new in it today, something settled, not finished, but no longer fleeing. June arrived first. She'd brought a small crate of paints, not for the wall, for sharing. Set it gently on the bench, then crouched beside the lower edge of the mural, where some of the earliest drawings had started to fade. She didn't try to fix them, she just added beside them. A line here, a shape there. Lucia showed up next. No backpack, no headphones, just a half-used sketchpad under her arm and an old brush in her hand. One of Marisol's gifted quietly months ago by Eli with no ceremony. She didn't greet June. June didn't greet her. Lucia just sat on the ground a little to the left, found a small patch of bare wall and started tracing shapes over the old clouds. Not covering, layering, like memory does. Eli arrived last, carrying nothing. He looked at the two of them, one kneeling, one cross-legged, both painting without speaking. Then he sat on the bench, stretched his back with a small grunt, and after a moment picked up a piece of chalk left in the groove by someone unknown. He walked to the far right edge of the mural and began to draw a single horizontal line, then another just beneath it. Railroad tracks, faint, delicate, leading off the frame. No one asked what it meant. He didn't explain. By mid-morning, all three were working side by side. Not always close, but always aware of each other. Like people who'd shared a storm, even if they'd each weathered it in different rooms. At one point, Lucia paused. She looked over at June, and instead of a question, she simply passed her a square of cloth to wipe her hands. June took it, nodded once. Nothing more was needed. Later, Eli stood, looked at what the three of them had added. A bird with patched wings, a porch light with no house around it, a hand, not holding, just reaching. And in the corner of the mural, under the window no one ever painted inside, Lucia had written in small, near-invisible letters, "We don't start over, we just start from where we stopped." No signature, no arrows, no explanation. When the sun began to shift and the light bent across the alley in long gold beams, none of them said goodbye. They simply stepped back, wiped their hands, and left the brushes where someone else might find them. The wall stayed, not as a monument, not as a message, just a memory that hadn't finished being remembered. The table had always been too big for two. Lucia used to complain about it, said the old oak slab made dinners feel emptier than they were. Said the silence between bites echoed too much. But that evening, as the light outside tilted toward amber and the kettle began its soft whistle, the table didn't feel too big anymore. Eli had pulled out the extra chairs, dusted them like it was any other Thursday, put an extra spoon in the soup, though no one had confirmed they'd come. He didn't ask, didn't call, just set the places as if absence was no longer the final word. Lucia came down first. She didn't say anything about the three bowls. She just took her seat. Not the one she always used, but the one to the left, closer to the window. June arrived a little later. She didn't knock. She didn't need to. She stepped in through the side door, took off her jacket, hung it where she used to the first week she arrived, before she left. She paused in the hallway, hands still on the hook, as if waiting for someone to question her being there. No one did, so she walked in, took the seat opposite Lucia, not claiming it, just accepting it. They ate in quiet. But it wasn't the old kind of quiet, not the kind filled with things unsaid or avoided. This was softer, like the hush of a room where someone is finally resting. Eli passed the bread. Lucia reached for the butter. June refilled glasses. No one asked, "What now?" No one said, "I'm sorry." No one explained anything, because no one needed to. The porch light flicked on by itself. Motion sensor installed years ago by Eli, meant to scare off raccoons, but it had ended up being the only thing that stayed on every night, even when no one came. After the meal, Lucia stood and began gathering plates. Eli moved to help, but she waved him off. "You cooked?" she said simply. It was a sentence with more forgiveness in it than most apologies. June stayed seated a while longer. Her fingers traced the rim of her glass. She looked up at Eli. "I started something today," she said. He waited. "It's small," she added, "but it doesn't feel temporary." Eli nodded. That was all she needed. Lucia came back with 3 cups of tea. She'd added cinnamon to the pot just because she remembered her mother used to. Even if none of them liked cinnamon that much, it stayed. They sat a while longer, the kind of sitting that had no purpose except to not be apart. Outside, the mural glowed under the streetlight, not bright, just enough. And inside, the kitchen hummed with the warmth of people who had no name for what they were but knew enough to keep showing up anyway. No one said, "We're a family now." No one had to, because they'd found something harder and quieter. A rhythm, a place to rest the weight. And that night, when Eli turned off the kitchen light and walked past the porch, he paused, looked out at the alley, at the mural, at the 3 cups still warm on the table, and he thought, maybe some stories don't end. Maybe they just keep making room. It started with the lighthouse. Not a grand one, not the kind you see on postcards or coffee tins, just a simple weathered tower short wide, leaning a little to the left like it was tired of always standing tall. June painted it over the course of 3 mornings. Not on the wall this time, but on canvas. Not for everyone to pass by and forget. This one was different, private, deliberate, finished. She worked in the back room of Eli's garage, beside the old sawhorse and a stool with one leg shorter than the others. No one interrupted. Lucia brought her tea. Eli left a rag folded beside the brush tin. No questions, no pressure. The lighthouse came together slowly, stone by stone, light by light. At the top, the beacon didn't glow bright, it glowed soft, a dull amber pulse like it was saying, "I'm still here. I've always been here. I'm not loud, but I last." The sea below was painted in long, tired strokes, not violent, not still, just moving because that's what it did. When she finished, June didn't sign her name. She just looked at it, stepped back, and for the first time in a long while didn't feel the need to start over. No gouache soie, no painted over patches, just the whole of it. Flawed, crooked, real. She left it leaning by the door, didn't say where it should go, didn't offer it, didn't explain it. But that evening when Eli walked into the garage, he saw it, and he knew. He took it carefully. Dusted off a quiet spot in the front room. Above the fireplace no one used anymore. Hammered a nail, held the frame to the light, and hung it. Without ceremony, without comment, just a simple motion. This belongs. That night, Lucia passed through the living room on her way to brush her teeth. She stopped, stared at the painting for a long moment. "It's not perfect," she said. Eli, nearby, sipped his tea. "No," he said, "it's better." June came in last, paused in the doorway, saw the lighthouse on the wall, and instead of bracing like she always used to, she exhaled. "Thank you," she said. Eli didn't say, "You're welcome." Didn't need to. He just nodded. The kind of nod you give when something has landed, and you don't need to catch it anymore. They sat for a while. The house hums differently at night when people are no longer afraid to be still. Later, as the porch light blinked on, Lucia lit the candle on the windowsill, a habit her mother used to keep. Not for scent, just for warmth. Just for the small reminder that light doesn't have to be loud to be seen. And somewhere in that moment, no one felt like they owed anyone an explanation. Not for what had happened, not for what hadn't, not for what came next. The mural outside would fade. The colors would run with rain. Chalk would wash away, but this one painting, this one light would stay. Hung not to impress, but to witness, to whisper, to remind that some people leave, some return, some stay quiet beside you and let you repaint your own name. And some lighthouses, they don't guide ships, they just prove that something still stands after the storm. You don't always need to start over. Sometimes you just need to stay.